The quiet stillness of a suburban evening was shattered when the cold glare of a flashlight cut across a black woman's face. In the next instant, a gun was pointed at her chest, drawn not by a police officer, but by a self-appointed security guard from the neighborhood's HOA. To him, she was just another suspicious stranger. What he didn't know was that the woman standing frozen under that beam of light was no ordinary target. Behind her calm, steady eyes lay years of elite training, discipline, and authority. Because in reality, she was an FBI tactical commander, and his reckless prejudice had just written a story he could never control. Aisha Daniels had lived her entire life navigating the weight of assumptions. Despite her commanding presence, decorated service record, and the quiet confidence that came with years of tactical leadership, she knew how quickly her skin color could erase all of that in the eyes of strangers. On this particular evening, she wasn't stepping into a mission briefing or a high-risk raid. She was simply returning to her newly purchased home in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, a place where her success had finally allowed her to settle. The houses were lined with manicured lawns, driveways glistening with luxury cars, and neighbors who waved politely during the day but whispered behind closed doors at night. She had heard the stories about the HOA, notorious for its overzealous rules and unofficial patrols. What she hadn't expected was that their version of security would turn into a life-threatening encounter. As Aisha parked her SUV, the quiet air carried a sense of relief. She had just finished a grueling week training new agents and was looking forward to a weekend of peace. Yet the unease in her chest grew the moment she noticed a dark sedan trailing her as she entered the subdivision. To an outsider, it may have looked like a curious neighbor checking in, but to Aisha's trained instincts, every detail screamed surveillance. The car slowed as she pulled into her driveway, and before she could even step out, a figure emerged, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. This wasn't the battlefield she had prepared for. This was her own neighborhood, and the most chilling part? She wasn't being treated like a homeowner. She was being treated like a criminal, in the very place she was supposed to belong. The man who had stepped out of the sedan wore no uniform, no badge, nothing to suggest legitimate authority. Yet he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed power belonged to him by default. He barked orders, gesturing with the gun as if her very existence in the neighborhood required justification. To him, Aisha was not a homeowner, not a professional, not a woman returning from a long week of service to her country. To him, she was simply a black woman in a place he didn't believe she belonged. Aisha's instincts kicked in immediately. Years of tactical training urged her to disarm the threat, to neutralize the weapon pointed recklessly in her direction. But another part of her, the disciplined commander who had led teams into volatile situations, knew this wasn't just about her. Any sudden move could escalate into tragedy, not only for her, but for anyone else who might come outside in curiosity. So she stood still, hands visible, every muscle taut with restrained control. The man's voice grew sharper, more accusatory. He demanded to know why she was there, whose car she was driving, and what business she had in his neighborhood. His words dripped with suspicion, but beneath them lay the deeper toxin of entitlement, the unshakable belief that her presence required his permission. Neighbors began peeking from their windows, curtains shifting as shadows gathered. Some recorded, on their phones, whispering among themselves, feeding the spectacle instead of intervening. None of them stepped forward to say the truth, that she was not a stranger, but their new neighbor. The silence of the crowd cut deeper than the accusations of the man with the gun. Aisha's chest tightened. She thought about the dozens of news stories she had read, the countless names of black men and women who never made it home because someone decided they didn't belong. And here she was, standing in that same narrative, with a firearm inches away from becoming her ending. The HOA security officer, finally announced that he had already called the police, convinced he was performing some heroic act of protection. His arrogance was so profound that he never questioned whether he was the danger. He strutted with false confidence, blind to the fact that the woman he threatened had commanded federal task forces larger than his entire neighborhood. But Aisha stayed silent. She knew what he didn't, that within minutes, law enforcement would arrive and the truth would unravel. She wasn't powerless, she was calculating. This wasn't about showing him her credentials. This was about exposing what happened when prejudice, unchecked authority, and ignorance collided in the open. As the sound of distant sirens began to rise, Aisha's steady calm contrasted sharply with the trembling bravado of the man holding the weapon. He believed help was on the way for him. What he didn't realize was that he had set into motion the most humiliating and career-ending moment of his life. Because when those patrol cars arrived, the officers wouldn't be saluting him for his vigilance. They would be saluting her. Red and blue lights washed across the quiet street, cutting through the night as squad cars screeched to a halt. The so-called security officer puffed up his chest, lowering his weapon only slightly, confident that his backup had arrived to finish what he started. He gestured toward Aisha as though he had caught a criminal in the act, barking explanations that painted him as the vigilant protector of the neighborhood. But then, the doors of the patrol cars swung open, and everything changed. The first officer out didn't move toward the armed man. Instead, his eyes widened when they landed on Aisha. Recognition flashed instantly. Without hesitation, he straightened, snapping into the rigid posture of respect reserved for the highest authority he had ever served under. Within seconds, other officers followed suit, their demeanor transforming from cautious readiness to outright reverence. The armed man froze, confusion etching across his face as he watched them approach. Not him, but her. And then the words he could never have anticipated shattered the illusion of control he had clung to. "Commander Daniels, ma'am. At your service." The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors who had been hiding behind curtains stumbled onto porches, jaws slack as they realized the truth. This was no stranger. This was an FBI tactical commander, a woman whose leadership had shaped federal operations, whose presence demanded respect in the highest halls of law enforcement. The man's arrogance collapsed in an instant. His trembling hands betrayed the panic creeping in as officers surrounded him, ordering him to drop his weapon. The gun clattered to the pavement, and with it, the last of his authority. He tried to stammer excuses, insisting he was only protecting the neighborhood, but his words dissolved under the weight of reality. Aisha never raised her voice, never needed to. Her steady silence was more commanding than any outburst could have been. The very system he thought would vindicate him now stood aligned behind her, and the truth was undeniable. The only threat in that neighborhood had been the man with the gun. As the armed man was handcuffed and led toward a squad car, the weight of the scene settled over the neighborhood like a storm cloud finally breaking. The residents who had watched silently now shifted uncomfortably, realizing their silence had not been neutral. It had been complicity. They had seen a black woman threatened in her own driveway and chosen not to speak, not to intervene, not even to question why. For Aisha, it wasn't victory she felt. It was exhaustion. The irony was bitter. She had commanded tactical teams through some of the most dangerous missions in the country, yet here she was, nearly killed in a gated community she had worked her entire life to afford. Her rank, her medals, her years of service had not shielded her from prejudice. Stripped of her title, she had been reduced to a stereotype in seconds. But this time, the truth had been undeniable. When the officers saluted her, when the neighbors finally recognized who she was, the mask of superiority the so-called security officer wore crumbled. His downfall was not just the humiliation of being exposed, but the reminder that ignorance and arrogance carry consequences. In the days that followed, The HOA faced investigation for hiring untrained, unauthorized security. The man himself faced charges for assault with a deadly weapon. The community attempted to repair its fractured image, offering apologies that seemed hollow in light of the danger she had faced. But the story had already spread far beyond the neighborhood. It became a symbol, a cautionary tale of what happens when prejudice overrides judgment and when assumptions replace humanity. Aisha returned to her home with the same steady resilience that had carried her through years of service. She knew this incident wasn't just about her. It was about every black man and woman forced to prove their right to exist in spaces they had earned. And as she stood on her porch that night, the flashing lights fading into the distance. 1. Truth echoed louder than all the apologies. Respect should never depend on a title, a badge, or a salute. It should depend on recognizing humanity. So the question remains, how many more stories like this must unfold before society finally learns?